as we await a vaccine and we continue to social distance and wash our hands, those of us who are responsible enough to do so, one of the things that's obviously super neglected and too neglected, except for those of us who are holistically inclined, or whether it's practitioner or patient, or those that just do their own research, is obviously the third of the trifecta of not spreading the virus or perpetuating the virus is our own immune system, which is huge, and evidenced in the patients who are most susceptible to all infections, let alone coronavirus, which is elderly and obese patients, just people who are generally weaker. And so it is super important. It is our responsibility as much as it is the responsibility of epidemiologists, scientists. It is their responsibility, and it's the government's responsibility. But there is a third responsibility at hand. There is a third sort of front line, and that front line, and arguably the most important one, is us, because if everybody was had an optimum functioning immune system, it would dramatically reduce the spread. It's just that optimum functioning immune system is not something that you can necessarily objectively measure, and so it's hard to determine. But we know, we can discern sort of between healthy people and less healthy, obviously. From a Chinese medical perspective, the immune system is referred to as the Wei Qi. It's spelled Wei in the pinyin. Obviously, it's a Chinese word, Wei Qi, and the Wei Qi is really saying like the strength of the immune system, and where it comes from, and where it has always come from a Chinese medical perspective in the ancient medical texts, is from the stomach and the lungs, is from the digestive system and the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system, from a biomedical perspective, is not that far of a stretch, right? Even a lot of Western doctors and biomedical people, they recognize and associate the lungs and the respiratory system, the respiratory microbiome, with obviously immune function, things to do with allergies, and obviously the COVID symptoms to do with the cough and sore throat and congestion. So that's not that far of a stretch. But even more forward-thinking and modern Western doctors are now acknowledging and discovering this connection between the gastrointestinal microbiome and our immune system, and discovering biomedical evidence of it that really supports the Chinese medical perspective. And so it's not that far of a stretch for any reasonable mind, any critical thinker, to think that obviously the healthier our metabolic system is, the healthier our immune system is going to be. And so, from a Chinese medical perspective, the nature of coronavirus is very cold and damp. It is the same nature from which it comes. Wuhan in China is a very cold and damp climate, just like sort of a place like Seattle or Portland, Oregon. And it's funny, a lot of patients, they sort of make fun of or raise an eyebrow at a lot of our diagnoses for them, because they've never heard anything like it before. Chinese medicine diagnoses a lot of times sound like a weather report. We're always telling people like, oh, you're too cold, or you're too damp, or you're too hot, you're too dry. And there is something to this. When somebody is too damp, which most of us are to varying degrees, it's just referring to fluid retention or water weight around the organ system or the tissues. And this is very common. Everybody has this to some varying degree, but some people are more susceptible to it than others. The most susceptible people to it, and the most primary sort of Chinese medicine 101 example of it, is a very obese person, is a very sort of obese person who is carrying around a lot of excess water. Somebody with a lot of edema. This is signature symptoms, biomedical symptoms of what Chinese medicine calls dampness. And so it's not that we don't recognize biomedical diseases. We do recognize biomedical diseases, like things like edema or fatty liver disease, but we don't need that diagnosis to determine, oh, this person has dampness kind of encumbering the liver or encumbering the kidneys, attenuating their fluid metabolism and causing the edema. And that's just one example of edema. And so, some people are are too hot or too cold. Usually warm body people tend more to hypertension and hyperthyroid, and cold body people tend more to hypothyroid or hypotension. These are generalizations. These are very simplified generalizations, but just to give you an idea of kind of which ways these patterns, these sort of weather forecasts lean, in when we translate them biomedically. But so it's really important, in order to strengthen the immune system, we have to strengthen the stomach. In order to strengthen the stomach in a way to counterbalance the nature of coronavirus, we want to be the opposite of cold and damp. And so we want our stomach and our diet to be very sort of warm and dry. Now, what are the coldest, dampest foods and drinks? The worst things, the coldest and dampest foods and drinks are ice cream and beer and sugar. Ice cream is the most, has the evil trifecta, or I should say the trifecta of evils from a Chinese medical perspective. It's freezing cold, it's dairy, and it's sugar. So it has the inflammatory allergen of dairy. It has the obviously toxin of sugar, and then the ice cold nature of it actually constricts the blood vessels in the respiratory and gastrointestinal microbiome as it's going down, thereby making the whole system much more vulnerable to the inflammatory effects of the other two substances that it is made of. So I mean, ice cream shops in the age of coronavirus really should have warnings on them, like cigarette packs. I mean, they really should. I mean, I'm sure I don't have the time right now to study it scientifically, but I'm confident that it actually could be scientifically evidenced. And of course, sugar is the worst thing. Ice cold drinks, even cold foods. This we'll get into another time, but raw foods, things like salads and smoothies and yogurts, from a Chinese medical perspective, although they do contain the scientific nutrients and constituents that they claim to, in the context of a scientific lab, in the context of the human body, they actually don't agree with us from our perspective, and as well as from an Ayurvedic perspective. The human body is 99 degrees or 98 degrees depending on the person, and so it's a warm climate. And so putting cold and raw food into the climate asks the body to do way more work than it really wants to do. And so Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, much more encourages people to have a lot of warm foods that are warm on the stomach, easier to metabolize, easier to absorb the nutrients. And so we recommend people have a lot of stews, a lot of soups, things like eggs, things like a lot of green vegetables, obviously, but mostly cooked, roasted, sauteed, steamed green vegetables, steamed vegetables. People sneezing with damp lungs are here. It's okay. I don't live alone. Yeah, but so we really encourage kind of like this warm diet, and that will create kind of a warm gastrointestinal microbiome, which will then in turn create stronger wei qi, a much stronger immune system. Obviously, things like ginger tea are great. Teas in general are great, but things like a lot of carbs are very damp. Sugar is very damp, and so junk food and fast food and these inflammatory foods that ruin the stomach are then going to in turn ruin the immune system, and they are basically the equivalent of people not wearing masks and not social distancing and being very haphazard. They are the equivalent of the epidemiologists not doing their job. And so forget about your long-term health, which will also greatly benefit, but definitely encouraging people to sort of, and you could obviously message me for more information and more suggestions on how to avoid a very cold and damp diet, and I'll put a link here to more information, a blog that I have about that, about how to avoid that and eat more sort of warming, nourishing, strengthening foods that aren't so inflammatory, that just sit in the gut and are much more vulnerable to something like coronavirus, which is cold and damp. Yeah.